The crystal wine glasses shimmered under the chandelier, throwing fractured light across plates my mother had inherited from her own mother. China that cost more than most people's cars, and was only ever used when there was something worth performing. 25 relatives sat beneath that chandelier, and not one of them knew that in the next 60 seconds, I would dismantle my sister's career with 11 words typed under a tablecloth. But first, she had to say the thing she'd been saying for 33 years. Clarissa stood at the head of the table. Structured blazer, flawless bun, the courtroom posture she'd been practicing since she was 12. She tapped a silver spoon against her glass, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet for people who've learned to command them. "I have some news," she said. "As of this morning, the board has voted. I am officially the youngest junior partner in the history of Bradford and Yates." The room exploded. My mother clasped her hands like she was in prayer. My father, a neurosurgeon who'd spent 40 years treating dinner conversation like a medical grand rounds, raised his glass of vintage Cabernet and said, "That's my girl. Partner at 35. A legacy in the making." Clarissa basked in it, let her eyes travel the room, drinking in the applause. Then her gaze landed on me. It wasn't a look of sisterly affection. It was the look a hawk gives a field mouse before descending. She gestured toward me with her wineglass, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim, and said with the light, dismissive tone of someone who'd rehearsed this moment too, "Of course, not everyone can follow the traditional path of success. Elena here is still exploring. 33 years old, still tinkering with her little computer projects." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Every dynasty needs a cautionary tale, right? Elena is just a waste of space, honestly. But we love her anyway. She keeps us humble." A few cousins looked down at their plates. My father chuckled. My mother, the Honorable Justice Sterling, a retired federal judge whose dissenting opinions were still studied in law schools across the state, patted my hand with the expression she reserved for stray animals. "Don't worry, darling. Maybe next year." 2 seats from the kitchen door. Same seat I'd occupied at every holiday dinner for 33 years. I smiled. Porcelain calm. 33 years in the making. Then I slipped my phone under the tablecloth. The screen glowed softly in the shadow of the linen. I opened my email. Typed 11 words to Marcus Thorne, my lead attorney. "Effective immediately, all capital commitments are hereby withdrawn. No exceptions." Pressed send. Then picked up my fork. Through the open archway, I could see the foyer, and I was ready to wait. But this story doesn't start at a Thanksgiving table. It starts in a garage, and with a check that nobody looked at. When I dropped out of pre-med after 1 semester, my father left the dinner table in silence. A punishing silence that lasted 3 months. That night, Clarissa sent me a text. I still have it saved. "Congratulations on throwing away your future." They saw a dropout, a girl playing with toys. They didn't see that I was already coding algorithms that would outperform their retirement funds. A security vulnerability I discovered in a banking app had earned me a bug bounty that would have taken my father 6 months of surgery schedules to match. An app I built to track rare sneakers had been acquired by a tech conglomerate for 6 figures before my 21st birthday. I told no one. Every time I'd tried to share even a small victory, Clarissa found a way to reframe it. A fluke, a distraction, not quite real work. So I stopped competing. I let them believe what they'd already decided. Meanwhile, I kept building. By 25, I'd sold a cybersecurity startup for $8.2 million. I remember signing the acquisition papers in a glass conference room overlooking the bay, my hands steady and thinking, there is no one I can call. Not because I had no one, but because the people I would have called were at a dinner table at that exact moment, raising a glass to Clarissa's first year at Bradford and Yates. I drove home to an apartment I'd paid for in cash, made coffee, sat by the window. I thought about that check on the kitchen counter. 3 days. not one question. Then I got back to work. I used that 8.2 million to found Obsidian Ventures, a private investment fund focused on professional services firms, law offices, accounting practices, medical groups, the kinds of businesses my family worshipped but didn't understand from the capital side. I understood them intimately. I had grown up listening to my parents discuss the politics and economics of their professions over Sunday roast. I knew that even the most prestigious law firms were often one bad year from crisis, their balance sheets fragile, their cash flow dependent on a handful of major clients, their partnership structures designed to extract profit while leaving almost nothing in reserve. By 30, Obsidian Ventures managed $85 million in assets, 11 employees, a corner office on the 37th floor overlooking the river. My family thought I worked in computers, somewhere downtown. They weren't sure exactly where. They never asked. When Bradford and Yates approached Obsidian Ventures 4 years ago, I laughed so hard I spilled my coffee. The firm was in trouble. They'd lost 3 major clients in a corporate espionage scandal that wasn't their fault, but had tainted them by association. Senior partners were threatening to leave. They needed capital, 4.2 million minimum, and the banks were nervous. My analyst brought me the deal without knowing my connection. Strong underlying practice, he said. Just needs stabilization capital. The upside is significant if they can weather this. I looked at the partner roster, and there was a familiar name. Clarissa Sterling, senior associate, on track for partnership. My sister's firm. Desperate. Coming to me. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I invested 4.2 million through a blind LLC, structured as a silent partnership. No mention of my name anywhere in the documentation. To Bradford and Yates, we were simply a fund making a strategic bet on their recovery. And recover they did. Within 2 years, they were profitable again. Within 3, they were thriving, expanding into new practice areas, climbing the rankings, the trade publications running features about their remarkable turnaround. Crediting the partners' strategic vision, their unwavering commitment to excellence. No one mentioned the anonymous 4.2 million. No one knew to mention it. Every quarter, I received detailed reports. Client retention, associates promoted, Clarissa's trajectory toward partnership. And every holiday, she looked at me from across the table, me, in my seat 2 seats from the kitchen door, and said some version of the same thing. Little computer projects. Waste of space. Maybe next year. I want to be honest about what that cost. Not the money. The money was simple. I mean the other thing. The thing where you close an $8 million deal and there is no one to tell. Where you look at a quarterly report showing that your capital is literally holding up your sister's career, and you have to keep that fact inside your chest like a stone, because telling anyone would require explaining everything, and explaining everything would require them to have been paying attention, and they never were. I won't pretend the 37th floor was always peaceful. Some nights it was just quiet, and quiet, when you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, is not the same as peace. November came the way it always does in New England. Cold air sliding under doors, leaves the color of old bronze, and the Sterling family mansion filling with the smell of roasting turkey and unearned confidence. I ran my 3 miles along the river that morning. The water was gray and still, my breath disappearing in small clouds before reaching the bridge. I showered, put on a cashmere sweater the color of charcoal, stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I had drafted the withdrawal email 3 weeks earlier, saved it in my drafts, opened it every morning, read it, closed it. Effective immediately, all capital commitments are hereby withdrawn. 9 words. Enough to undo $4.2 million of invisible generosity. Part of me still wanted to keep the money in place, to keep being invisible. to keep holding up the house no one knew I was carrying. That part of me was the 12-year-old who brought a check home and set it on the counter and waited. 3 days. Not one question. But then I walked into the dining room. 25 relatives. The chandelier. The Tuscan linen. Clarissa at the head of the table, already holding court. The wine glass. The gesture. Every dynasty needs a cautionary tale. And my mother's hand on mine. Maybe next year. Something in me didn't break. That's the important part. Nothing snapped. There was no rage, no hot flush of humiliation. There was clarity. The kind that arrives quietly, after a very long time. The way a decision becomes obvious not because anything changed, but because you finally stopped waiting for something to change. I reached under the linen, added 2 words to the draft. No exceptions. Pressed send. Then picked up my fork, cut a piece of pie, ate it slowly. Through the open archway, I watched Clarissa's silhouette against the foyer light. I watched her confident posture collapse, slowly, the way a building settles before it falls. Not all at once, but floor by floor. I watched her hand fly to her mouth. I watched her press her back against the wall. The rest of the table tried to continue the meal. Forks moved food around plates. Conversations started and stopped. Everyone kept glancing toward the hallway where her voice kept rising, cracking in ways I'd never heard from my always composed sister. What do you mean withdrawing? That's impossible. But the partnership vote was Monday. When she finally returned to the table, she looked 5 years older. Perfect makeup smudged, hands trembling. She sat down heavily and stared at her untouched pie like it might contain answers. Our silent investor, she said, her voice hollow. The capital partner that saved the firm 4 years ago. They're withdrawing. All of it. 4.2 million. They want it liquidated immediately. The table went silent. I took another bite of pie and said nothing. The weeks that followed were quiet from where I sat. 37 floors up, the river below, the quarterly reports still arriving on schedule. But I read them differently now. Bradford and Yates' balance sheet, without the capital buffer, looked suddenly exposed. The banks that had been happy to extend credit started asking uncomfortable questions. The expansion plans that had been approved went on hold. The partnership track that Clarissa had worked toward for 8 years, frozen indefinitely. Word travels fast in corporate law. Within 2 weeks, 3 of Bradford's top-tier clients requested transition meetings, a polite way of saying they were leaving. The Whitfield Group, Meridian Capital, Strauss & Associates, who had been with the firm for 11 years. A senior partner named Richard Davenport, who had stayed because the firm turned a corner, submitted his resignation. He took his client book with him. 2.1 million in annual billings. Gone. 2 more partners followed the next week. The American lawyer ran a piece. Bradford and Yates, from recovery to freefall. The article mentioned the anonymous investor's withdrawal. It used the word hemorrhaging twice. Clarissa's landmark case, the one she denounced to applause over Thanksgiving, was footnoted as the firm's last significant win before the decline. Footnoted. I didn't do any of this. I didn't call the clients. I didn't tip off the partners. I didn't whisper to anyone. All I did was remove what was mine. The rest was gravity. When you build a career on someone else's foundation and never ask whose it is, when the foundation walks away, the career doesn't need a wrecking ball. It just falls. My father called Clarissa for the first time in his life to ask about money. Not to celebrate, to ask. How bad is it? Clarissa told him it was manageable. That's what she'd been telling everyone. Manageable. Under control. Temporary setback. I sat in my office on the 37th floor and read her name in a trade publication and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Not satisfaction, not guilt. Something in between. The specific weight of being right about something you never wanted to be right about. She called me 3 days after Thanksgiving, first time in over a year. Elena. Her voice was stripped of everything I'd ever heard in it. No courtroom resonance, no practiced ease. Just a woman calling her sister. I need your help. I thought I was a waste of space, I said. Why would I have useful connections? This isn't... She stopped, took a breath. I'm sorry I said that. It was harsh. But this is serious. My career is on the line. Please. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up. My mother called next. Then my father. The message was the same each time. Help your sister. Put aside whatever petty resentments you have. Be the bigger person. Family is family. I've been helping, I said to my mother quietly. More than you know. What does that mean? Nothing. I'll see what I can do. I let 2 more weeks pass. Let Bradford exhaust every other option. Financial advisors, partner networks, every investment fund in the region. None of them committed. Law firm investments were specialized, and most funds that did this kind of deal had already made their allocations for the year. Bradford and Yates was running out of time, and Clarissa was running out of road. On December 20th, I texted her, "Come to my apartment tomorrow at 2. I think I can help, but we need to talk in person." Her response was immediate. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll be there." She arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. I watched from the lobby as she stepped out of a taxi, not the town car she usually took. She'd clearly agonized over what to wear, professional enough to show respect, casual enough to suggest this was a sisterly visit rather than a desperate plea. Cashmere sweater, designer jeans, the uniform of a woman trying to appear at ease. The doorman greeted me by name. "Good afternoon, Miss Sterling. Your guest, your sister. She's expected." Clarissa said nothing as we rode the elevator. Said nothing as I unlocked the door to my apartment. 2,400 square feet, floor-to-ceiling windows, the river below catching the afternoon light. Art on the walls she didn't know the value of. "This is..." She looked around, unable to complete the sentence. "I've lived here 3 years," I said. "Sit down, Clarissa." She sat on the leather sofa, looking as uncomfortable as I'd ever seen her. The woman who commanded courtrooms. I placed a folder on the coffee table between us. "Do you know who Obsidian Ventures is?" I asked. "That's the investor withdrawing," she said. "Arthur's been trying to reach someone there for weeks. They only communicate through attorneys." "Open the folder." She did. Inside, the operating agreement for Obsidian Ventures, showing me as founder and managing partner. Bank statements documenting the $4.2 million investment in Bradford and Yates. 4 years of quarterly reports. Profit distributions flowing from her law firm to my accounts. The partnership agreement that Arthur Bradford himself had signed, never knowing that the silent investor saving his firm was his newest partner's little sister. I watched her face go white, then red, then a shade of gray I'd never seen before. "This is..." She looked up at me, back at the documents. "You're Obsidian Ventures." "I'm the majority owner and founder, yes. But that means 4 years ago, when the firm was in crisis. That was me. I invested $4.2 million to save Bradford and Yates from collapse. To save your career, Clarissa, before you even knew it needed saving." She was crying now. Silent tears, the kind that come before a person knows they're crying. The composed lawyer who never showed emotion in court. She didn't reach for the chair I'd offered. She sat down on the floor, right there on the hardwood, in her $1,200 suit, with the river behind her and 21 years of assumptions collapsing in front of her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "All these years, everything I said, and you never—" "Would it have made a difference?" I leaned forward. "Would you have treated me differently if you'd known? Or would you have found a way to minimize it? To say, well, Elena's little investment helped, but really it was our hard work that saved the firm?" She didn't answer. We both knew what the answer was. "I spent my entire life being compared to you," I continued, "being told I was the failure, the dropout, the waste of space who couldn't get her life together. And the whole time, I was building something that dwarfs your law firm salary." I let that sit for a moment. "You never asked. You were so busy being the successful one that you never wondered what I was actually doing. You just needed me to be a failure so you could feel like a success." She sat with that. "What do I have to do?" she finally said, barely above a whisper. "To save the firm. To fix this. Tell me what you want." I stood, walked to the window. The river below was steel gray, unhurried. Two options. Option 1. I complete the withdrawal. Bradford and Yates scrambles to find replacement capital. Maybe they succeed, maybe they don't. Your partnership gets delayed. A year, maybe 2, maybe forever. You figure it out the way I did. Alone. In a room that smells like solder fumes, without anyone handing you $120,000 for a down payment. She closed her eyes. Option 2. I reinstate the investment. Renegotiated terms. A larger profit participation, a seat on the board. No longer silent. I paused. And at the firm's holiday party next week, when they announce your partnership, you introduce me to Arthur Bradford, as your sister, as the founder of Obsidian Ventures, as the person who saved his firm. She opened her eyes. You want me to publicly acknowledge that you have been bankrolling my career for 4 years. I'm not asking you to humiliate yourself, Clarissa. I'm asking you to tell the truth. There's a difference. I turned from the window. And honestly, the truth is more interesting than the fiction we've both been living. She was quiet for a long time. I could see her wrestling with it. The 33-year-old story she'd been telling herself about who was successful and who was not. "One more thing," I said. "No more waste of space. No more comparisons at family dinners. No more treating me like an embarrassment you have to explain. From now on, you treat me as an equal, because that's what I am. That's what I've always been." She looked at me for a long time. Really looked. Maybe for the first time. "I've been horrible to you," she said quietly. "I don't know how to fix that." "You can start by accepting option 2. The rest will take time." She nodded slowly. "Option 2. I accept." The holiday party was exactly as awkward and exactly as satisfying as I'd anticipated. Clarissa's hand rested tentatively on my shoulder as she spoke. "Arthur, I'd like you to meet my sister, Elena Sterling. She's the founder and managing partner of Obsidian Ventures." Arthur Bradford's face moved through several expressions. Confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like stunned respect. "You're Obsidian," he said. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks." "No hostile takeover," I said, shaking his hand. "Just a strategic realignment." We renegotiated that evening. A board seat. A significantly higher profit participation. In exchange, the firm got stability, and Clarissa got her partnership. She was officially made partner on January 15th. At the celebration dinner, she gave a toast. "I want to thank my family for supporting me," she said, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her before. "And I especially want to thank my sister, Elena. I spent years being an arrogant sister. I threw every insult I could think of at her. I treated her like she was invisible, while she was quietly building something extraordinary." A pause. I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I'm grateful she was generous enough to offer me redemption. The room applauded. My father looked between us like a man trying to reconcile two maps of the same city. One he'd been using for 30 years, and one that turned out to be accurate. After dinner, he pulled me aside. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. Elena, I thought you were drifting. I thought eventually you'd need a handout to survive. I was so worried about the sterling legacy that I didn't realize you were building your own. You never asked, I said. You were so busy defining success by your standards that you never wondered what I was doing. He nodded slowly. I'd like to change that, if you'll let me. I didn't tell him that I'd stopped needing him to understand me a long time ago, that the forgiveness had already happened, quietly, without ceremony, the way everything important in my life had happened, when no one was watching. Later that night, my mother found me in the hallway. She held my hand and said nothing for a long time. We stood there, the retired federal judge and her daughter, who built empires in garages. And the silence between us was different from every other silence I'd known in that house. I should have asked, Elena, she finally said, about all of it, from the beginning. I know, I said. She squeezed my hand once, then let go. That was enough. Not because it erased anything, it didn't, but because it was true. And she said it. And we were both still standing. It's been 6 months now. Clarissa and I aren't close. We may never be. But the architecture has changed. She calls to ask my opinion on firm finances. I ask her about legal structures for new acquisitions. At Easter dinner last month, my mother asked about my work. Not to fill silence, but because she actually wanted to know. It wasn't enough to erase 33 years, but it was a start. Last month, a magazine reached out. Women in Private Capital. The headline they're proposing, The Quiet Force, how Elena Sterling built an empire in the shadows. A little dramatic. But after 33 years of keeping everything a secret, a little drama feels earned. And at the holiday table last December, the one where everything finally shifted, I was still sitting 2 seats from the kitchen door. Same seat I'd always had, but the table knew who was sitting in it now. And choosing that seat again after everything, knowing that they finally knew, that was a different kind of power. The quiet kind. Welcome back to the podcast of Legend Leader. Let's click a little bit more, because here's what I've learned. Being invisible is a form of power, but it is also a form of prison. You can build empires in silence. You can hold up houses that no one knows you're carrying. You can swallow 21 years of proof and drive home to the 37th floor and tell yourself the silence is architecture. But eventually, not for them, not to prove anything, not because you finally got permission, you have to step into the light. Not because you need their validation, but because hiding when you've done nothing wrong is its own quiet kind of shame. Space is exactly where you build things when no one is watching. And I built an empire. Hi, Blugs, we've got a first podcast. Before we do with a translection of this week, you can find the best recently 2026. We can look at the positive adjustments to go Tuesday or Nessastayn. And back to Dirledy begins with a translection of concerns. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. I tell stories like this every week, about women who chose peace over war and won. And that question, should she have told them earlier, or was the silence the point? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.